I'll start, perhaps, with two views. My own way of finding my way to the Protestant Church was a fascination, at that time still in East Berlin, for civil rights movements, peace, ecological concerns, so the Church mobilized. And I had been brought up atheist, and at school they kept telling us religion is opium for the people. The opposite was the case. People moved more than the system intended. So Christianity, being active, ethics, turning to the outside world. My dissertation was initially on the subject of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the training of theologians in resistance to the Third Reich, because I was interested in the fact that Bonhoeffer, as someone who taught theology students to meditate again, what does that have to do with opposition? So how can one support the other? Bonhoeffer also says that the church is only the church when it is there for others, but on the other hand, he also speaks of the realm of the arcanum, and he even lives this together with theology students in a kind of monastic community, and says that living together is inner preparation for outward service. And suddenly I had brought the two together again, and asked myself from then on, that was my habilitation thesis, how can that look today? So my dissertation concludes in the epilogue with somewhat thoughtful words. Spirituality today in the Protestant Church, because I had already met Bonhoeffer's students, which was great. Albrecht Schönherr, who was part of the Common Life experiment, was part of the innermost core of this almost monastic community, and Albrecht Schönherr was the chairman of the Church Federation of the GDR, so he really had social responsibility, and he also told me that he was still doing what he was doing, motivated by Bonhoeffer. He was a seminary leader in Brandenburg for a while, and of course he put common life on everyone's bedside table, the brothers, so hardly any women who were studying at the time, and then tried to get that across under Eastern conditions, and he said, no, nobody was interested in common life. They preferred to go to their brides at the weekend. So he said that this had to be tackled in a completely different way under different conditions. Then my first approach in a scientific context was to look at what spiritual exercises we have as Lutherans. Luther speaks of lectio, meditatio, oratio, tentatio, i.e., reading the scriptures, then moving the word within oneself, meditating, then prayer, then contention. Yes, and how scientists do that. I first tried to look at it from a psychoanalytical perspective. So that was the habilitation on piety and symbolic play, a psychoanalytical contribution to a Protestant theory of piety. While I was writing it, I secretly came to the conclusion that psychoanalysis was enough, but you don't have to say anything against Lutheran forms of piety. They already have value from a psychoanalytical point of view. You can do it that way. So I didn't really get to the experience of transcendence back then. And I also got myself a footnote from another, now retired professor of practical theology, Manfred Josutis, who then also said, yes, so Miss Bobert then dissolves the whole experience of transcendence into human sciences, and I really deserve the footnote. In the meantime, I am standing here in front of you. My development path has continued in order to take a completely new look at how we can achieve a living spirituality in Christianity again within the framework of today's living conditions. And my focus is not only on spirituality, but actually also on mystical experience. And on the other hand, as someone who was shaped by all these civil rights and ecology movements in his youth, the question naturally remains as to how we can continue to bring this together with our living environment. So you can already see that in my approach. I'm talking about city hermits or urban hermits. So I say no, nothing in the mountain gorge, but my mysticism is a mysticism for the working people, i.e., in the combines, VEBs and factories, in the collectives. That's always the case when you're also a migrant to a certain extent and only ever adapt to the other language culture. Sometimes it's fun to bring your own language forward. So ethics from direct empathy, that's one approach, an ethically committed church. And on the other hand, the somewhat helpless question, yes, ethics, spirituality. My path after psychoanalysis then led me via a riding accident right into the Asian meditation scene for my own rehabilitation purposes. 4 years of Taoist yoga, Tao yoga according to Master Mantak Chia, with original Asian teachers. And they also made a statement on ethics and Christianity, saying that what you do as a church is ethical vampirism. Why? Yes, you suck people dry. You demand the last thing from them without connecting them to the source of life. And we here, what we do with you here, Taoist yoga, is we connect you to the source first. And so the two have diverged a bit. That's also, so no matter which rooms I get at the church congresses, I simply move them to the cemetery, like in Stuttgart recently. And then there's room for well over 100 people. But that's really cute. At church congresses, there's still this focus, such a small room, 25 people for mysticism, huge halls for commitment. So that's not quite the balance. So spirituality still seems to be ethically irrelevant. Yes, navel-gazing or something like that. Or perhaps even dangerous. Perhaps the church itself thinks spirituality is opium for the church. It's a funny question. Again, only ethics are worth anything. So I'm going to start with a radical thesis. The best way to teach ethics and lead people to ethical decisions is to take them on a path of personal development, as mysticism has taught in Christianity in particular, because if we look at the great mystics, Benedict of Nursia, the founder of the Benedictine order, Hildegard of Bingen, Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order, they wrote world history, as did people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi. These are highly developed ethical people who do not want to lead out of a motive of want, but out of a vision. So there are now spiritual management theories, and one that I really like is by Dana Sohar, and I think if I remember it correctly, her title is, sounds very strange, IQ, EQ, SQ, intelligence quotient, emotional quotient, spiritual quotient, and it complements that. So that's a very, very readable presentation. What do we simply measure with the IQ? So on the one hand, it was used to sort out migrants that the USA didn't like. So it also has a certain political history, what you do with it. Then in the meantime, the discovery that emotional intelligence is totally important, not just for leadership in companies, but for the entire corporate culture. So not just for the individual. So the development of individual personality and SQ, spiritual intelligence. So my perspective of world perception decides what I develop as a target vision at all. And my thesis is that these people, these great mystics in Christianity, they have developed SQ, so the IQ anyway, the emotional quotient and SQ. And so that it doesn't seem so detached. I'll just give you a few thoughts on what, yes, spiritual development quotient means ethically for a leadership culture alone. Because Dana Sohar says that we can want to lead people out of different motives, and there are deficiency motives and there are surplus motives. And a deficiency motive would be, for example, because I have always felt so small, I would like to be in front, or I like to exercise power because I feel powerless, or because I need recognition, I want to be something important. So then I lead so that the others, the ones I lead, give me something. And she says, of course, it's always a bit problematic. So that in itself is important for leaders to look at. So it can sometimes be a mixture of motives, and the form of the day is not always the same. But what are my main motives for wanting to lead? And if we then simply take, no matter how you feel about it, the debate about an unconditional basic income, someone takes on a leadership position, brings something to the social debate because he has a vision. Now, you could also say that he just wants to make himself important. But you can also decide from the matter that is something important. Or Martin Luther King with the civil rights movement finally against, in fact, North American race theory, the whites as the dominant race. So not only in Germany there was race theory, but what is now known, the Nazis were enthusiastic. They first adopted leading American works. And Martin Luther King stood up there and said, I have a dream. So that is the highest form of leading people. By having spiritual experiences and being connected to the source, that you have a vision of where humanity as a whole will develop or what it is actually destined for. And there's something like the Thomas theorem, which is a sociological theory that if people believe something is real and act on it, it becomes reality. So even if it's just a vision, there's also the funny tip from the Jesuits. Yes, if you've lost your faith, just act as if you believe. But now the sociological example. This is a married couple, Thomas and Thomas. Just like Thomas and Thomas. And if you look at Wikipedia, for example, Thomas theorem, then you have this. If it were spread that a bank is bankrupt, people would behave like this and the bank would go bankrupt. No matter how solvent it is. So it's not nothing. As soon as you bring a vision into a society and get people to behave accordingly, we can do this, or we can do almost anything, or I can do this or something. That's nothing more than a vision at first. And then you would also have to encourage people to behave accordingly. These are things from the area of spiritual leadership skills. So it's not just about simply implementing 5-year plans that are communicated, but actually perhaps also a temporary retreat from all the hustle and bustle to gain an overview of what people are actually meant to do. What else can societies become? I can't go into that too much detail in this overall area. A fairly loosely written book. Of course, spirituality also goes through different development cycles. God is 9.0. The title sounds strange in the sense of 9 versions of God, and it's clear that the latest upgrade is of course the best, but it also presupposes God. 1. Zero View, that's written by Marian Kustenmacher and Tilman Haberer. Like Kustenmacher and Haberer, that's really now to popularize that. Behind it are theories by Ken Wilber that religions themselves also go through upgrades of themselves. So at the beginning there are simply needs for basic security. So yes, there is a God, we are provided for, the world is good, God is good, that people are assured of something like that. Then there are phases of expansion and conquest. One tribe fights the other, also the phase of the holy warriors. We always have to say, we have been through that ourselves. So with our crusades, we have fortunately left ourselves behind, and I've moved on to ideas of equality for society, which are also derived from religion. Christianity came into the world with the idea that it is not a tribal religion, so that others have to be flattened, but the inhabited globe. Ecumenism is humanity, and in this respect it says more than nation-state ideologies. That's why it always cracks when the Americans say, in God's name. We are the called people, really to the point. That's what political speech says, the chosen people. And that's why we are the highest. And that's why there are also lower peoples. And that's why it's not a war, but we're just colonizing the world a bit according to our ideas. So that's always difficult when religion is taken into the service of nationalist ideas, but it has a greater vision. And this is simply shown individually what spiritual stages of development individuals go through, but also societies. This is written very loosely in a nutshell. So I'm not talking about spirituality per se, but I'm trying to address higher stages of development that are inherent in every religion tonight. And that's what I mean by mysticism, because going to church is spiritual in itself, singing songs is spiritual, drawing icons would be spiritual, even going on crusade was considered a spiritual exercise in Christianity. Fortunately, it's no longer so popular, so everything is spiritual somewhere. But we realize that there is an innermost area where the religions converge, and that is simply the area of mysticism. Mysticism sounds very wispy, very dark, and I call it salop, for example, because I am always asked what I understand by mysticism, for example. I say mysticism is, I see something that you don't see, and that is God, and that is a bit cheeky. The art of a highly refined perception. You could also say actively controlled evolution. In other words, that you don't wait for the swarm to move there. The mystics never did that. It can therefore provide impulses both for society and, of course, for individuals. These are a few suggested definitions, but we could also say total awareness, and from awareness, consciousness, one naturally also asks which processes in the brain are involved, and in the meantime we have meditation research that actually translates mysticism into the topic of brain frequencies in certain brain regions. And just as it is unimaginable for a couch potato that you can train until you can jog 5 kilometers in one go, so it is. We in the West, as the Buddhists are now showing us, are something like mental couch potatoes. So we can't even imagine that you can train your brain frequencies, that you can train what emotional state you spend the day in, that you can train how much noise is in your head, and until then, that you can also intervene in psychosomatic processes in a healing way, not only in yourself, but even in others. And we had all of that in Christian monasticism. So at the beginning of the lecture, I first went into that. On the one hand, we have an ethical, also in the Protestant area, that's my company. In the Protestant area, politically very active, outward-looking churches, but which devalue spirituality a little bit. And then on the other hand, we have Asian approaches, which are not necessarily so politically world-shaping. And Bonhoeffer actually, that is still my role model, who thought both together in the approach, up to resistance in the Third Reich, motivated by his spirituality. So now we are in the area of what is mysticism, and I want to slowly bring it together with ethics. In ethics, this is still, from my student days, who knows what refinements there are. There was a rough distinction at the time. There is this so-called deontological ethics, i.e. normative, which says exactly what is good, what is bad. And these are, for example, 10 commandments, and then at that time it was still a bit like the so-called utilitarian ethics, i.e. simply exaggerated the end justifies the means. So a very bad ancient example, although that is of course completely indicative, the Epicureans. So go ahead, you can do anything you want, but make sure that you are still happy in the end. So you can do all sorts of things. You can get into so much trouble in the process that you still end up with a eudaimonistic ethic, i.e. eudaimonia, feeling good. And that remains contradictory for a long time. Of course, we also have, so to speak, the highest goods, an ethic of values, and we can discuss this for a very long time. In the meantime, the utilitarian models in our society have been somewhat revalued again, purely by chance, because how do you want to justify values and norms? The whole thing seems more pragmatic. So how does the mystic now position himself? We actually seem a bit slow and sluggish because they actually withdraw first and say, well, before I make any big decisions about the world, I first have to find out if I'm perceiving it correctly at all. So having read a bunch of books doesn't necessarily lead to an accurate perception of the world. Who knows what state the people who wrote the books were in? And I think that's fantastic. Even in 20th century Christianity, we still have really great mystics from the Christian Orthodox world. On Mount Athos, for example, they were able to do what medieval mystics said about seeing light, healing cancer through prayer and things like that. One of them was a hospital chaplain at the Athens Polyclinic. He only died in 1991 or 1994 and cooperated with doctors. So you can no longer say that these are medieval legends. And people from this type of people, who actually lived as hermits, said that by nature God created us to be transparent to each other, so that we can understand each other without words. And therefore what we call clairvoyance and so on. They have always said that these are not supernatural gifts at all, but are the basic state of the human being. When the soul has been cleansed of its eclipses, then we are transparent to each other. And that is this immediate direct empathy, because as soon as I broke the subject, I can assure you that I can't read minds, that they could read minds too. It has a panic effect. And then we realize that this is an ethical issue. So the boundaries of the other, I don't have the right to my own pretense, lie. That's summarized. I'll tell you one of my embarrassingly funny incidents about the first clairvoyant mystic. A very modest, actually small, somewhat crooked, still relatively young man, Berlin-Prenzlauer Berg, before it became Swabian, who worked as a healer in one of the backyards. And we met. He wasn't a Christian, but he could do an incredible amount. And I was fascinated with him. I started by talking about mysticism in general, because there are very few Christian monks there. And then I sat with him in front of the house on an old wooden bench in the sun, in front of this apartment building in a residential street, and thought silently to myself what such a small, cowled little man can do. 5 minutes later, in silence together, Misha said, "Even though I'm just a little man in a hat, and that's how we understand this great original state in which God created us transparently for each other, I don't have a right to my own thoughts and so on. And that's why I say that there is actually no more political person of the caliber of Jesus Christ." So imagine someone who is in a position, this mysticism of direct perception, of direct empathy, to know immediately what politicians are actually thinking, what their goals are. So from my point of view, someone who, as a mystic, I take this seriously, has such abilities as Jesus Christ, that's a political issue, so it amazes me that he even lived for 3 years. So he would hardly have had time to be here. And for me, that is also part of the area of mysticism and ethics. Before I get to all these core topics, I want to introduce them so that it doesn't seem too mystical all at once. If you look on the internet, enter Remote Viewing Institute into Google. It's an American organization with a website in German and French. This is not a spiritual path, but a scientifically based way of turning them into mystics. And they offer courses in remote viewing. They cost quite a lot, and now you can say, oh, esotericism. It's interesting that they promise you that if you're a trained, highly precise remote viewer, you'll have great opportunities in companies and beyond. And the really exciting thing, I won't say any more about it in the context of an evening like this. The really exciting thing is that they point out that they can apply for EU funding for their training. So this is a whole topic in the mystical field who actually also deal with political issues, these so-called PSI agents. These are the things where I say, if you do the course, think about what it means for your family, and you won't be allowed to change sides for the rest of your life. So it's like, it takes longer than a marriage to get into something like that. You won't be the only one with perceptions, so there will be others looking at you again. So don't say that Bobert advertises for RVI, I won't get a penny, I don't want to. Another name. Also mysticism, ethics, direct empathy, so you'll notice that you can do both with empathy. So you can actually harm people, but you can also help them. Joseph Mack, and that's a word now, but I can't get it in a row. Monagle. What was that something with PSI in the title? Joseph McMonigal. In the meantime, you're making a bit of a fool of yourself from a scientific point of view. Yes, those were such paranoid attempts by the CIA back then to train psychics. Yes, the programs no longer exist. I don't want to ask in what form they have been reissued, but he was one of the first. He was an atheist military man, then had a near-death experience for health reasons, and suddenly realized that he was floating above his body, and thought he had been there for more than a year. Consulted psychiatrists because he thought he was crazy, because he ended up in areas of perception that no psychic teacher, no pastor, no institute had said. And he immediately empathized with people. I think he could also read people's minds, or knew what they were going to say next. And as a member of the military, he also found the appropriate support. And that is now one of the ways you will also see. I also offer something like frequency-based meditation. I have to come up with it somehow, and I always try to justify everything scientifically. So he had a great trainer who worked on brain frequencies. Now they say it wasn't all scientific. It doesn't matter. But at least they worked on brain frequencies tuning, so that they gave him targets. Envelopes were placed somewhere 60 kilometers away, and he was supposed to say what the location of the envelope looked like. And he was also supposed to describe the device, also from the inside, how such a machine is built and so on. He learned to draw precisely, and in this book he describes something with PSI agent or something like that. So if you just use McMonigal or PSI, then you have the title on Amazon, for example, and he describes where his first perceptual errors were, how he got better and better. He describes the mystical worldview, and as a mystic, you are fascinated by how someone works with these abilities in a religion-neutral way, and also describes the worldview of a mystic in a religion-neutral way. There are neither space nor time boundaries. The funniest, craziest mistake was how he describes a target, and he reflects this in the book. You have an envelope hidden in a place that was just a stupid parking lot, nothing else going on, huge open space, and he describes this place as flowers, flower beds, fountains, shopping centers, people, describes the houses, how they are built, or in the square, you say. Complete failure. 5 years later, he drives past the place in his car and sees flowers, flower beds, fountains, and things like that. Yes, the mistake was they didn't tell me at what time I was supposed to see the place. And in the timeline, of course, it focused on the interesting look of the place and not as a parking lot. So I love this scientific accuracy, and it simply reflects that as a source of error, but also what that means when it can already read data from the future at a location. So now you can say in hindsight, it was all bullshit from the paranoid CIA, and he says he's still 99% secret. And in the book, he only describes 1% of what they did and what they could do. And of course, he complains that at some point, the project was no longer funded. Another thing from mysticism and the military is the so-called goat killer. So we always hear spiritual healers, it's nonsense, it doesn't work at all. Of course, I go into this kind of thing in the mystical advanced seminars because I think it's important to say, firstly, that mystical abilities, as an Easterner, I always ask, who benefits if you tell the masses that it doesn't exist? It's unscientific. And if you now scientifically, well, the EU won't support anything that isn't scientifically based. The EU offers scientifically sound training courses with international state funding to train people with a high level of precision in the company and beyond. I say, as a religious mass provider, perhaps we need a scientific upgrade ourselves. Let's take the goat killer, who simply learned about Asian concentration techniques. I don't know. At the beginning, the military only tested him to make goats sleepy. And at some point, yes, they can kill them too. Now he just concentrated on the heart of the animals and killed them. Then it's clear that you can't just do that with goats. And anyone who is a spiritual healer knows, yes, of course, it works. But, and this is the mystical hurdle, and I want to talk about this tonight, when Misha knows that I have called him a little twisted man in my mind and is a mystic. Then he will feel my panic, my terror, my shame at that moment, as he says, even if I'm just a small, twisted little man, and they will flood him. And in this respect, and you can anticipate this here through thought empathy, what do I trigger in the other person when I show, hey, I'm standing in the middle of you? When I try to use the abilities that are actually simply there for this purpose, it is so mysticism uses the highest communication network among people, namely love, openness for each other. So being disarmed, being defenseless, so it is the most intimate form of encounter, while a physical encounter is still rather outside, and she uses it to repair humanity again as the network it is meant to be. And network is something other than collective massing. But network really consists of all the individual points of interweaving, and one is there, the other is there. It is an organism, humanity as the body of Christ. That's the vision, and when one of them gets to the source, he will of course use that to repair the people in his network. And if I know something like that is possible, and it's not just voodoo, the Asians have also practiced the beginnings of it with us. If I were to try to focus my attention like a laser beam in order to stop a goat's heart, I would also perceive its death throes, the suffocation, the panic, because it would notice how it is approaching cardiac arrest, and this panic would flood me. And that is the absolutely natural inhibition for a mystic to do something to someone, because you always live with the other person. And that's why there is almost nothing more difficult for a mystic than arguing in a partnership, i.e., when you insult the other person or something, the pain of the other person immediately floods through your own lungs like a knife. And what is usually said, that everything is one, is a direct experience for the mystic. And Albert Schweitzer, when he had reached this stage, said that life is life, that life wants, and his main religion as a humanist was simply fear of life. These are, of course, second questions. How do I actually construct an ethic from these experiences? But I would first like to give you an understanding of what mystical perception of the world means, as close to experience as possible. So what does a mystic experience? How is he in the world? And I'll come back to that. So first of all, I want to say that there is a great need for not only one side to arm itself, because there is, I'll leave judgments. It's on YouTube. I want the video to stay there too, old OC. Yes, but it is all the more important, if so, simply analogous to our cultural level. If so, and so many intelligent people are already working for the arms industry, it is more important to train the others intelligently, so that they can perhaps also work for hospitals and for education and the like, in the peaceful sector, and that's simply what I mean by pent-up demand. And what appears here as seemingly supernatural, mystical abilities, yes, which sounds like that to us at first because we haven't trained them. These are actually only basic human abilities, such as intellectual abstract thinking and the like. And that is also in the Middle Ages, they could not yet think abstractly like we do. And that is why I say that mysticism is simply taking evolution, the individual and humanity, into its own hands. Because in the Middle Ages, if you read the philosophical texts, then it's Lady Wisdom talking to Lady Folly. So that's personified, because here there was no abstract Sophia or concept of wisdom and stupidity. You had to put it down like that. And even earlier in antiquity, they couldn't even read silently. That's too high a feat of abstraction. And we can only understand that if you ask yourself, yes, when I see a score or music, do I hear it immediately in my head, i.e., by reading it quietly, or do I have to play it on the instrument first, which would be reading it aloud? So we see, for us, it's a matter of course. But it's gigantic. There's so much evidence that when churches and monasteries and cathedrals were built, the master builders and schools made drastic miscalculations, but stupidly also to their disadvantage. But there were only a few experts who could still do some mental arithmetic. And then there were also drastic miscalculations in the calculations. So it's quite natural that evolution continues. And mysticism has something to do with teaching people to control their own brain frequencies using seemingly mythical methods. That is to the point, so that is currently my biggest concern, that I try to get mysticism out of the dungeons of monastery ruins and churches, because I say that culture at the current stage of development simply needs a further step forward in evolution, and religion and the availability of consciousness controlling techniques, but to some extent they have distanced themselves from it. So the Protestant Church, you can look, where has mysticism gone? We still have it. So with God, everything in us is currently silent. Ter Stegen and so on, we have really great mystics who were trained in ecumenical networks, Ter Stegen and Madame Goulion and so on. With Christoph Blumenhardt, we had a really great spiritual healer. People came over the threshold of his church and the consistory. The church authorities forbade Blumenhardt to lay his hands on people because he healed severe scalds all over the body with burn blisters that disappeared immediately before the eyes of those present around 1850. But the church authorities forbade that because it was too mystical, and then he said, "It doesn't matter. It's enough if I pray for people like this. They would be healthy too." So mysticism has not simply been lost. That is, unfortunately, mysticism always poses the question of power as a grassroots democratic movement. It no longer needs hierarchies. It is radical democratization. And on this occasion, I say I would like to bring mysticism back into the church as a spiritual grassroots movement in 2017, because that is actually the Protestant program for today. So mysticism means giving people techniques. Today, we also have to justify this scientifically, that they themselves learn to control their brain frequencies. And then it's this, I see something that you don't see. It's like this. If we look at this, these are now very rough indications. Every meditation scientist can laugh at me a bit now, because he says I would now have to explain in which brain region, which frequency is measured, because the brain is actually an orchestra and has different frequencies in different areas. So we can think of it analogously. We now also measure the frequencies EEG, i.e. electroencephalogram, and ECG from the heart, and that's one body, but different frequencies in different places, and so we can also have them individually in the brain, but that's getting too wild now. So if we start by saying that by and large 0.5, 0.3 hertz, 1 hertz is a sinus curve per second, so that's great. Mysticism becomes measurable, and that's the beauty of the new measurement methods, i.e. EEG can measure that very precisely in terms of time, and then an MRI tube can totally localize it in which brain region. So EEG is always stupid. You can't say exactly where it was now, but they can show in a flash in a second profile how something changes. There is always the question of which region to place the probes in and so on. So Let's do it this way. Transfer mysticism into our science today. Because in order for it to be ethically relevant, I can't ask people to become Christians or Sufis or Buddhists. Because religion would have to say why it is reasonable to follow this path from the point of view of a Western person. Because that's also part of the ethics of mysticism. That I don't just follow some external guide, but increasingly follow the inner voice, so I become more and more myself, and am then increasingly directly connected to the source. So I'm not a lifelong disciple. We had that in the 70s. Yes, so these illusions of the super saintly gurus have fortunately disappeared here. Now we are in the 4 Hertz range. Again, the 8, 14, 4 Hertz. That's delta. That's deep sleep. The average person is simply unconscious, and that's the great range. The masters can still observe themselves in deep sleep, so they still have witness consciousness there too, and that's why they are able to act. Deep sleep, i.e. the delta band, is the most suitable for transferring very strong frequencies from one person to another. In the meantime, we hear about perpetrator healing or something like that. That's one above it. That's about 4 to 8 Hertz. That would be dream sleep, REM sleep, where we make rapid eye movements. So we only have about 4 to 8 sinus curves per second. So dream sleep. Then above that, we slowly wake up. That's alpha. That was in the 70s. Come down to alpha and so on. Because you're so much in beta, these stress people, yes, I don't like going to work so much. There's so much beta. They're all in beta. And then you do a relaxation exercise and come down to alpha. What's the problem with alpha? They tend to be suggestible on alpha. So alpha is great for artists because we actually get out of the everyday rush of thoughts, but we would be daydreaming. So now you're doing beta. That's great. That's 38 Hertz. But then there's already a sense of panic, and that's relaxed external perception. This area is the everyday area and is accepted as the only reality by current academic theology, but also by the preachers who are so average. And the world is described from the beta band as our ethics and ethical systems. Beta is dominated by the sense of sight, and that is clear. The sense of sight is directed outwards, external perception. When we are on beta, in everyday consciousness, that is really relaxed, so still relaxed. Sitting in front of the television without deep relaxation. Here, deep relaxation is still being awake, and here, deep relaxation is falling asleep and really dreaming and scratching away here. So, when we are on beta, we have a lot of thoughts in our heads. We lose contact with ourselves, i.e. the inner world, our feelings. We hardly notice ourselves at all. And so for a person who is on external perception, they're working through a lot of things. They don't even notice that they might need to go to the toilet or something. And I have to go again quickly. You want something? You want something. No contact with themselves. This is where the opposite begins. The outside world becomes irrelevant. I become increasingly aware of my inner world. And now we understand what Ken Wilber wants. He has a quadrant theory that says the outside world exists as me and us, and the inside world also exists as me and us. And we have to take all 4 quadrants into account in order to create an accurate description of reality. Because Wilber has already gone through all of this so well, I say, okay, then I'll take the area with the frequencies, because you can describe the same thing again there. And there you can say what mysticism wants, i.e. which frequency ranges it wants to lead you into. And what I'm still waiting for is for this to be measured. When Buddhist monks go, ooh, these overtone throat things, these are frequencies. So for musicians, you can translate frequencies into light color sound. So from then on, you can talk scientifically about singing bowl massage and stuff like that. What frequencies are produced with this? So any musician could say, yes, chamber tone A used to be tuned like this, Now it's tuned much higher and all that sort of thing. This can all be expressed in Hertz frequencies, and we could stop speaking different dialects in the spirituality scene. So frequencies are like Esperanto, or say Latin or English, or whatever you want to use as a universal language, as a metaphor. So the problem is that in the beta state, you can really only make limited statements about ethics. It is the most unmystical state there is. And that's why the mystics always say, come inside, and now there's much, 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 much more to it. Only partly the measuring technique, because I don't know what it is. He's doing research. He's now up to 70 hertz in meditation research. And the way that I try to convey to people, I'm going to put it really crudely, is it, or also in Zen, something like witness consciousness. Unfortunately, the average academic theologian doesn't realize that there is the possibility of witnessing it in their own thoughts. So, of course, as a philosophy, this whole deconstructivism is a great philosophy. The fact that you also go back to why did you develop which system, that was all Eurocentric and so on. Yes, and the other indigenous peoples were all just the colonists. And people really too, that's blatant. The Nazis didn't invent the theory of race. It was the old colonialist thinking of the European. And fortunately for the European, the black man remained somewhere in Africa. The North Americans, the USA, had exterminated them in their country, the blacks. Yes, the lower slave race, the Indians genocidally, almost all of them. They are still alive in South America. Unfortunately, this is not an exception. And it's great that people are now philosophically taking apart all these seemingly universally valid concepts of the West from the perspective of the former colonial countries and so on. So beta only ever constructs what it sees, and it is therefore important, both through deconstructivism and now, to completely dismantle thoughts again and examine the framework in which they apply, or how relative they are. And the mystic observes that thoughts and feelings come into being. And there are also theories that things materialize, i.e., simply what our brain presents to us as solid, immovable matter. So matter is energy and energy is matter. And it can be transferred by saying that Jesus fed the 5,000 and so on, or that he pulled out a fish, a piece of gold. That's easy. For him, this world is simply a hologram, and he can create holograms. So when you see Sufi masters like in Berlin Neukölln, unfortunately one of them was just a bit on the Hud trip, it became increasingly clear to me. About 5 years ago, Sheikh Esref Effendi was already preaching there. The holy war against the unbelievers was starting from Damascus. Everything was still peaceful then. And his sheikh is in northern Cyprus, Turkey. So mysticism is not in itself a cure, is what I'm trying to tell you, but is first and foremost a way of perceiving the world. And then you always have to look at which military or national interests it is unfortunately associated with. So witness consciousness, there are kilohertz, there are megahertz. And from my point of view, what we call miracles, people simply have one. They are able to tune their brain frequencies in such a targeted way through certain exercises, tricks, that they can simply generate them. And of course, you can also transfer them. The funny thing is that a physicist like Nikola Tesla, a scientist who was also a mystic, didn't have to invent anything. And he also developed his design drawing largely mentally, and didn't have to check much more in the laboratory. And as early as 1920, he said that electricity could be transmitted without the need for cables, and that it could be transmitted wirelessly with much less loss than via electric cables. Unfortunately, he also developed weapon systems, which is why his legacy has fortunately largely ended up in the archives of certain institutions, but whether he is any good there. He also predicted that cell phones, i.e. cordless phones and the like would always be around. It's access to knowledge resources, but it can also be a bit of a Trojan horse if it falls into the wrong hands. I just want to say that it's not a mockery or anything like that, which is sometimes said to me in North German, Mrs. Bobbert, look in the mysticism, but rather it should be an invitation to take a closer look. And from my point of view, Jesus is actually a human being who shows as the target image of evolution what each of us is destined to be. That is, as the son and daughter of God, that is, as the archetype, what confronts us and what is in us. So we no longer have to invent the vision. But he does not say, you are a little sinner, repent now and you will remain a sinner forever, but you will do the same and greater things. So Jesus was not the type who constantly created a sense of guilt and sin and dependence in people, but on the contrary, I transfer my consciousness to you, receive the Holy Spirit, heals the sick and the like. So he was all about, you are my brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, this has now been combined with a bit of domination interests again, that they say, I have a Jesus allergy, so he shows us what a trained spirit can do. And that's why I'm fascinated by this figure like this, or rather this force field or person or whatever you want to call Jesus. From my point of view, it's important that we don't just go down, as is said in many spiritual movements, more and more relaxed, that's clear. So Jesus says, become like children. And that makes it clear that a cute baby, a lump like that, is still connected to the source because it doesn't think and has no feelings of survival when things are going well. And that's why people often say, I look into a baby's eyes and I feel like I'm seeing God, or I'm connected to source. Yes. That is, to get into the unification state, they have to go down towards the delta. And that's where people always get the feeling, when they sit for a very long time, I have the feeling that if I go on, there's a threshold, or then I have to die, or I'm afraid that I'll dissolve. Yes, because the more relaxed we are, the more our thoughts and feelings dry up. And that's on the threshold of delta. That's why you're afraid. But that's where the children come from. And that's why they have neither disturbing feelings nor disturbing thoughts and are in unity consciousness. Then, this dream, sleep, and daydreaming is how children usually spend their day, and that is why they are doing so well. They are not yet in beta. According to Piaget, this is abstract thinking, category formation, critical judgment, developing a personality center. And the mystic is basically trying to take this development of the individual one step further back. Now, why don't we glorify children? They are highly suggestible. That's why there are so many bad messages in each of us. In each of us, because we suggest them through television, mantra-like, great mental techniques. For example, this, buying makes you happy. Buying makes you happy, or you have to make something of yourself, or my teeth are crooked, or my hair is too short, too thin. So these are external views that we have internalized. There's a lot of poison there, and that's because children don't critically examine what they hear. So beta is important, but I would say that when they're sitting in front of the TV, they're at least towards alpha, if not lower, which means they're totally in a very hypnotizable state, which any hypnotist would be happy about. And now they get great mental techniques from an old religion, namely mantras, preferably chanted, nothing is impossible, and they are deeply relaxed, nothing is impossible, and so on. That's why even 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, hundreds of brands. So for me, that's also connected. First of all, when I say that mysticism leads to a new ethic, I also want to make it clear that it is misused, or that we are always in mystical states in everyday life, and therefore also warm ones, because of course they are misused. When they sit in front of the television, they should be in beta, i.e. thinking critically. Aha, nothing is impossible for whom? Why is that? In the car? Who says that? And which critical studies have proven this? Or in everyday life, on the other hand, they should be on alpha as much as possible, like in front of the TV, because it doesn't really harm them. In short, how do we manage that? There's a bit of what teachers call internal differentiation, which I can't really manage this evening, because I'm also bringing in all this mantra meditation. People who do Zen become observers of their own thoughts. And in seminars, I try to teach people one of the most important, mystically effective mental techniques. I tell them to choose a mantra, a sacred word, but one whose symbolic power really connects them with the unity consciousness, with the source, so not something like cucumber or something like that. Repeat it now as a mental focus, if possible constantly in the middle of everyday life. There are levels of practice, and that also leads to witness consciousness, and you don't have to sit for it. That's why I say my mysticism is mysticism to go, because we sit enough, and sitting can also kill you. If they have perhaps enlightened themselves, but only for a very short lifespan, that's nothing. And that gives them a frequency of over 40 hertz in the middle of everyday life. And they can be deep and relaxed, so that becomes a concert. And when they have taken root with a mantra internally, or even an unconscious area, then they immediately notice what a jingle does to them, or a radio song, Elsa, or visit the fresh food counter. They realize how they are being manipulated, not just some stupid elevator music that dumbs them down. You will now be in an almost hypnotic state so that you can hardly concentrate, but simply try to go shopping without your shopping list. Then they'll realize what's actually being done to them and why they need it. So that's it. There are people who have long known at what frequency we're being caught and how. And the response is, of course, tune yourself out. Why are the different frequency ranges important for mystics? Because their brain is like a radio. They only perceive what they have tuned in as a transmitter. And the current academic theology, I can only ever speak for academic theology, a lot is being done at a grassroots level in churches and conference centers, educational centers, like here. Yes, but the decisive factor is how the next generation is trained. That's where it applies, so to speak. You don't have to meditate to be a theologian. You can supposedly describe the whole of reality and make statements about God. While this is the most impossible state to make statements about God. In the Orthodox Church, i.e., and the Greek-Russian Orthodox Church and so on, theologians train by always basing themselves on texts by mystics, because they say that they have the entire realm of reality in view. And if we are not mystics, we always fall back on the old texts. That is also what the Dalai Lama does. That is why he says that the Dharma must not be changed. While Protestant theology says that there is something about Jesus in the Gospels, but if neither I can do it, nor can my garden neighbor Peterson, then Jesus couldn't have done it either, because I have never seen it in my beta state. But now he doesn't even realize that he might be saying, yes, I understand you too. On your radio you say info radio and culture radio. I only ever get RSH. So I don't believe you that there are other stations. And the mystic has simply tuned into other stations. And for me, that's today's way of saying that you don't have to become Protestant or Catholic or Buddhist or anything like that. But simply that there is education about it. So mysticism is basically the way of appropriating what is inherent in us, that everyone brings it forth. And that would change the education system, the corporate culture, and the like, because we would no longer have people who live the frequency that was set at home forever and say that this is now my identity too. Now let me take the next area. What kind of ethics follow from this? I distinguish between two groups of feelings. Let's take this range towards 38 Hertz, which is really mean. They have real feelings of stress there. Stress, panic, or something. So if an exam goes like this or something, and then there's also something in the higher ranges, unfortunately I couldn't find confirmation of this on the internet, but it's clear to them what frequency you have to emit in order to trigger mass panic to the point where people actually wet their pants or something. Perhaps that's really another example of the political area of brain frequencies and mysticism. There was a radio station here in the Stuttgart area. I haven't memorized the station yet. I'd have to look it up again. And the year wasn't that long ago, maybe 2012. And during the day it had a so-called sex frequency, a certain humming sound in its music program, but it also announced it, and yet people who didn't know that may have tuned in. Another example, Berlin Brandenburger Tor, year, I didn't remember it either. Rias Berlin was responsible for the music between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. So huge, thousands of people were partying on New Year's Eve. It was only announced in a small newspaper notice that the station would also mix a lucky frequency into the program in the brain-controlling frequency area as a lucky drug to make the party go better. As an analogy, if beer had been served with a happy drug and people only found out about it afterwards, they would have complained, but humor is just a frequency, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, it's not meant to be. There were still a few Berlin citizens who had read the press release and were puzzled, because they simply know, yes, Remote Viewing Institute, and so it was, that this is now not just a gimmick, but simply a mass experiment. So that's a thesis. A scientist only ever has a thesis, and one of them, his name is Franz Bludorf, then asked the press spokesman at Rias Berlin how they came up with the idea. Yes, our American subsidiary suggested it to us. Yes, please give me the contact details. What kind of idea did they have? I didn't quite remember. The answer wasn't that detailed. Yes, it was just a marketing gag or something like that. But it's clear that these things come from the arms industry, because they're the ones who know a lot. And the other things are, as I said, hints. In short, every television program, every piece of entertainment is close to influencing our brain frequencies, and the answer can only be similar to that in school. We are also bombarded with various intellectual concepts and ideas. Sit down, don't take it at face value, think instead of forbidding it. And so it is with frequencies. The mystic would say, learn to observe and eventually control your own brain frequencies, and then you are much less manipulable. And above all, the spiritual people who are most at risk are those who are on alpha as much as possible without having developed a witness consciousness at the same time, because they are particularly susceptible to hypnosis. Now in that area, that's called the survival fight. And that is, how do I now create, how do I get people on the path to developing a mystical ethic? Survivalist feelings. And then there are the actual human feelings, the feelings that we have when we are not fighting for our survival. Human feelings. That is the basis for emotional intelligence that mystics train. Feelings of fighting for survival include guilt, shame, fear, anger, hatred, depression, constant self-doubt, that sort of thing. And in this respect, it should be clear that a church is not promoting mysticism if it is always talking people into guilt. Or yes, you're not right. Protestant ethics can also give rise to new performance thinking. I have to do something. If I'm just doing well, I'm wrong. And I have to do something good to earn more points with God. That's where the Asians are. You can just be. And I understand everyone because they're fed up with the fact that they're now also apparently being made to feel like they're fighting for survival in the interests of God, that he sits in church as deeply relaxed and isolated from the noise of the street as he does in front of the television. It is hard to believe that these are actually human feelings, but the Dalai Lama is right. And he has every right to be the marketing leader. Happiness, love, joy, strength, hope, and so on. So the mystics always make a distinction. And when you read or hear that from the Bible, you think, now I'm not even allowed to be angry. Yes, God still forbids that too. But the logic is that our brains are really miserable in that area. And that really is the most anti-mystical area. So you really won't perceive God and say you feel separated. And life is no fun anymore. Unfortunately, when we watch the average TV program and what passes for news, these feelings are actually kept alive non-stop. It's like permanent panic meditation. On the other hand, if you read Greenpeace magazine or a magazine like Raum und Zeit or whatever you like to read, it does give you hope. Humanity is not as stupid as it sometimes seems in the media. So, whoever gives people mystical exercises or consciousness control will essentially try to teach people, regardless of which religion they follow, to get under the actual human feelings and to hold on to them as a basic state in the brain. And trauma psychology with the safe place and the like also benefits from this nowadays. And all these scenes that are in the Gospels, well, they were all functionalized in the Middle Ages when Jesus was made into the judge of the world. Watch out, little eye, what you see. It's so perverse. So, from my point of view, he came to raise the whole of society to the next highest and actually highest level of communication, namely that everyone is a mystic and experiences directly how they have always been connected in the network of love and communicate with each other. Because even the non-mystic is in a field of biocommunication, and every spiritual healer can log into it. But that's something else again. So it's not a ban, but it makes medical sense to get out of these things. Because that's where our evolutionary brain, the oldest thing we have in common with lizards and fighting lizards, often kicks in and says to the cells, give it your last year, use up all your reserves, and we'll survive. The body wears itself out, it cannot heal itself. And in the upper mode, the body begins to heal itself. So that's the area where miracles happen. And ultimately, these things are just like coins, they accumulate. So even feelings are not lost. They remain stored in the energy field. And a spiritual healer, or whether you want to try it yourself through meditation, simply has to bring in a larger amount of them in order to dissolve them. In other words, simply generate the counter energy. And in this respect, with chronic illnesses, there is quite a lot to dissolve. In short, mystic logical means bringing people into this emotional level. And then you are mentally very clear, totally calm, and totally relaxed. So you'll notice that I'm not always just talking about relaxation, but also about mental clarity, witness consciousness, and higher consciousness. And when you're here, that's now, if you know my basis seminar, you want to recognize that, so you want to bring about something male. Take my very cute gender neutral, religion neutral, where not everything is intergalactically representative. So this is our physical body. And now we have our, yes, that's not against the 7 bodies according to Hinduism, or the 9 bodies at least, so the physical body. And in ancient times and for a long time, in ancient theology, we had body, soul, and spirit. Nowadays we still have psychosomatics, and the soul, psyche, is obviously produced by the soma, by Bloomor chemistry, which is not true, even if it has been repeated often enough. So, and here spirit or nurhus or world spirit is different from ratio. And the problem with mystical perception, I see something that you don't see, is that when the soul now, that's not black, when the soul is in a struggle for survival, that's what Paisios, the Greek athos monk, meant, then the eye of the soul is darkened. It simply blocks signals. It's like a jamming transmitter or interference or gray noise. And then we are no longer in our biofield communication with others. And on the other hand, Saint Francis of Assisi, or in the book Sincere Tales of a Russian Pilgrim, it is always written about understanding the language of creation, a feeling of oneness. Now, the vacation effect, that's not necessarily due to whether you meditate or not, but a number of people also creates quite a lot of interference as a human field. At Christmas, a city like Berlin is really full of peace. It's like a huge group meditating. So the city feels great. And when you're on vacation, you also have the feeling of becoming one with everything. Because the people are there, which is different from a city vacation perhaps. But in nature, it's something like the order of creation. That's an old theory, creation in order. But it really is. The frequencies are harmonious, it fits, it's like a symphony, what nature does. And just by being there, it's like a group is meditating with us and putting us back in order. And that's suddenly you're on vacation so often and you have something like a mystical experience. So in short, if the place is good and the people who are there feel comfortable, their survival spasms are reduced, even without them actively meditating, and they have this feeling of increasingly being one. That is the disturbance factor on the level. And here, on the spiritual level, in suffering, there is of course also, oh God, the neck. Oh, the back, the lumbar vertebrae, the calvus. Well, let's leave it like that. Maybe a bit of skull bathing, really nice for migrainous and eye migraines. So, it's mean. But of course, if feelings have not been processed, they are increasingly deposited in the body as muscle tension. So we don't grow old naturally. It's an emotional segment. And if this is there, it naturally also causes disturbing feelings on a physical level and on a spiritual level, i.e., the mental level. These constantly revolving thoughts that you and the Zen Buddhists want come into the here and now. Because in your mind, this dung toad, and what will I tell you if I see it again tomorrow? You're in the past, you're in tomorrow, but you don't realize it now. And the mystic always wants to come to the here and now. So that's what we associate with the beta state. And we can't be inspired by that. And the ethics with mystical perception, I'll take the pet as an example because higher mammals are mystics without having to meditate, unless we teach them to think. At some point through chips or training, then they would be even more like us. But if you often notice that, what is the dog like? Then you know what the owner is like. Because pets are the weakest link. They're like the child in the family. And you don't have to talk to them, you don't have to explain things to them, they check in via biofield communication. So they don't need language, they don't need cognition, they just check what the field is like. So is it sad? Is it full of pain? Is it full of joy? And they take that over, they depend on it, and that's why they sometimes get the symptom of heart failure or lung metastasis or something first. Depending on whether it's someone who is in deep grief or full of pain or something similar. Somatization processes then take place between the master and the dog. And the aim is that if we learn to tune our brain frequencies more, firstly, this is very beneficial for our own health. And increasingly we will come to perceive ourselves as we were created as a basic state, so that we understand the language of creation. In other words, what Albert Schweitzer landed on. That we become one with what we are looking at simply by directing our attention. Well, that's what we horse whisperers or animal whisperers or something. I'm an animal therapist. Nobody believes that. But even just the beginnings of this opening of the soul's eye, simply shutting down survival feelings and you're there. He knows that you can dive straight into the feelings of a dog or a cat. And then the thing is, from then on, you don't have to be asked to take care of the animals or anything like that. Until then, you're hardly able to put on a mink coat, as beautiful as they look, because you constantly have the feeling that these poor animals are in the cage and the blood is stuck to the mushroom or something. So you don't need images and campaigns at all, because ultimately there's a spirit in everything, a consciousness, but in different forms, and that's what makes us individual. As a human being, I am a human being and not a cat. And as a human being, I am me and not you. So the mystic simply switches, he doesn't say. Now there is only one, or only separation, or one is bad. And from then on, you feel that what I do to him, I do to myself. So we are not as separate as we seem. Maybe that's a template for now, and from then on there's no need to discuss it anymore. Do I have to keep the 10 Commandments, or how should I behave so that I can be happy? It's simple. Behave and feel what you trigger. And that is, all of a sudden you feel what a wealth a single tree is, or how animals are happy, what they radiate, and then you say to yourself, am I stupid? So instead of asking, yes, what is a cat good for or something, we immediately feel it. The frequencies alone that a purring cat generates, they don't just do it for pleasure, but also to calm themselves down. That's why they purr at the vets, not because they feel so good, but because they feel so good. That's also a frequency I'm at. But it's not. It's an ethic that transcends any sense of purpose. And the more you are in this order and feel it, the more you don't need any special additional experiences of unity. Everything is created so perfectly. And then you stare at a puddle and see, wow, this highly intelligent fractal pattern. So in ice flowers or something, everything is intelligent, except for me. I want to understand it. So it's this humility before the beauty that's there, an ethic based on direct perception and empathy, which really only wants one thing, to convey this feeling and this perception to other people. And then they no longer need many concepts. So, of course, you need them to make yourself understood, instead of saying you're stupid now, and I dream that we can get there. But I would like it in that respect. My colleagues can perhaps lynch me a little. I almost feel embarrassed when I imagine it like that. But for me, religious education of the future doesn't mean that there will be, denominational religious education or state faculties for Muslims, which Muslim associations will have to agree on, and then religious education at schools by Muslims and then by Buddhists and whoever else. But the future is to get the sensible out of religion. The religion of the future is consciousness studies, investigating how consciousness works with frequencies, showing logically that even atheists who actually rightly rebel against stupid images of God are convinced that you can become a more human being along the way, and with rationally reflective methods. And then we also get other people for leadership positions, and the clearer they become, and the quieter the mind becomes, the more we really receive the comprehensive vision of how humanity is meant to be. And when you get there, it shows that you're not going to kill anyone for it. So from then on, we know that we don't really need the norm of thou shalt not kill anymore. So neither animals nor other people. From then on, you just know that it might be some religion, but it's miles away from God and from the source and from what humanity is all about, and you don't have to take it so seriously. So maybe you look at it with humor. but the political consequences of that are not my topic. I'm also a bit of a mystic, and maybe that's enough at this point. It's been a lot, and then we can ask questions after a break. Thank you.